Hi there. So we're going to talk today about the second round of PPP funding and describe 10 things that we know you all really ought to know going into this program, and then also answer a few frequently asked questions that have surfaced so far for us. So the first thing to keep in mind is that this second round of funding is available to business owners who have used a round one funding round. So round two of funding is only available to folks who have utilized their round two funds or are about to soon. The second thing to think about is that, like the first time, you have a 60-40 split that at least 60% of the expenses need to be used on payroll costs, which have the same definition as the first time around, and up to 40% can be used on additional items like rent, mortgage interest and property tax, utilities, those kinds of things. So similar kind of breakdown. And in terms of the period of time that you have to use them for, it's very flexible in round two. You can pick any 8 to 24 week period. So any 2 month to 6 month window of time, and that will be the period of time that you use for tracking this. Third thing to keep in mind, in terms of qualifying, anybody who is under 300 employees or less, right, and has experienced a 25% decrease in revenues for at least one quarter when you measure quarter to quarter, 2019 versus 2020. Okay, so want to very clearly emphasize a couple points here. Number one, you want to use the same method of accounting in both periods of time, whether it's cash or accrual. And the second thing is, you only need one of those quarters. Only one quarter of 2020 needs to show a 25% or more decline in gross revenues versus that same period of time in 2019. So you only need one of those quarters to qualify. Number four, you get the amount that you qualify for is based on 2.5 months of your average monthly payroll cost, which is the same as the first round. Or if you happen to fall into the industry classifications for accommodations and food service businesses, that has a 3.5 times average monthly payroll cost maximum amount. So if you fall in those industries which have been more heavily hit in the last year, you get a little bit of relief in that you get 3.5 times your average monthly payroll instead of 2.5. Number five, when is the application window? So you have until now. So already this week, we have now opened up applications at some institutions until March 31st. So March 31st is the deadline to apply for this round two of funding. Number six, if you are using the same lender, you may not have the same kind of documentation requirements. For example, they're not required to ask you for your 2019 payroll cost again. They're not required to ask you necessarily even for your revenue data. If you are getting a loan of 150K or less, they may just need you to attest to that information. Now, that said, we have already gotten a few early indicator reports that there are some lending institutions and banks that are asking for this information anyway, even though it's not required. But just wanted to alert you that there is some benefit to going back to the same lender, though you don't necessarily have to. So that's worth pointing out too. Number seven, there are two additional things that the loan proceeds can be used for in round two that didn't exist in the first round. One being money to pay for damages that were caused to your business as a result of vandalism during the year. And number two would be protection for your workers from COVID-19. So think about that kind of PPE equipment, those sort of things. Money that you're using to spend for that is also something that can be eligible for counting in that up to 40% other bucket of costs. Number eight, the loan has the same terms as the first time around. So the extent to which it is not forgiven is going to be a 1% 5-year term, right? That's on only the non-forgiven part of it. And it's worth pointing out here that in case you missed it, part of what also happened in the legislation that passed in the beginning of this year is we have clarity now that forgiven PPP money, that the expenses used to pay, that were used and paid for by this forgiven money are still deductible on your taxes. There was a lot of debate about that, but that issue has now been settled. right? So any of forgivable amounts that you receive are not going to be taxable to you. But if you do end up with any unforgiven part of this, it's a 1% 5-year term. Number 9, there are a couple folks who are excluded from applying, even if you do qualify based on the other measures. And the 2 that are worth noting are 1, businesses that have substantial ties to China. And then the second are those that receive grants under Section 324 of the Economic Aid Act. And those are venues, so sheltered venues. There was some additional support put in place for venues, and we know that a lot of our clients either are operating in that space or have connections with people that do. Unfortunately, if you do receive one of those grants, you're then excluded from applying for a round 2 on PPP. And then the last thing to point out, number 10, is that gratefully noticing that they want to have an impact on smaller businesses and directly in communities, the very first bit of applications that are opening up are starting with community lending institutions and community banks. And so if you already work with one of those folks, or if you have access to them, they're going to be the best place to reach out for to get an application filed this week. And then even more broadly, the applications will open up for folks in the weeks to come. So that's our 10 things we want you to know about the FAQ for round 2 of PPP. A couple other questions that have surfaced though that we just want to touch on. When can you apply, right? So hopefully by now you know that you can already start applying now, and you have until March 31st. And if you remember, even though funds ran out on the PPP initially earlier in 2020 for the first round, they did reauthorize additional money because they know the impact that this can have on small businesses. And I would imagine that you're going to see a similar thing happen here if in fact somehow they deplete the resources appropriated for that now. Another question that came up, if you got a first round PPP funding, does that mean you're not eligible for the second round? And in fact, that's actually the opposite. What's true is you can't really apply for the second round unless you've received a round 1. And also related to that, what if you haven't spent all of your first round PPP funds yet? Well, the way that they've worded it, they say that you have to have received a first round and you have to have either spent it all or will very soon, right? And then just think about it like this: the end, whatever the covered period is that you're using and spending your first round for, your second round period can't start until that ends, right? And then last question for y'all that we've seen pop up from a couple clients: what if my taxes for 2020 aren't done yet? Does that mean we can't apply yet? And for businesses that are incorporated or even just have strong financial statements to back up their 2020 data, I would say you definitely don't need a tax return completed. You can use financial statements as the support for your decrease in income. Now, for self-employed folks, Schedule C filers, that tax return preparation process might be helpful for you if your 2020 average monthly profit over the year was greater than 2019 in whole, even though you may have suffered a quarter of loss. And so it might make sense for you to try to get that 2020 tax return done, at least even in draft status. But also remember that if you're a cash basis filer, you may be able to use bank statements as a way to support your income over 2019 and 2020 and be able to show the loss in revenue that way. So it's absolutely not required. And I would say the tax return process and preparing that soon is really only there and an issue if it helps you in some way in making a stronger case or for claiming a larger amount. So hope that's helpful in navigating this round 2 process. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll add them in comments and drop them below. Thanks.